Protestant Christianity will begin to grow in Korea and will actually do quite well, though it's not going to ever, in the period we're looking at, be more than a couple percent of the population. I do want to emphasize that. I don't want you to think all of Korea is going Protestant. It's going to only be a couple percent at most in this early period. It's much higher now. But one thing that I do want to talk about as we think about the growth of Protestant Christianity is this thing called the Great Revival, which starts in 1907. And the Great Revival is this series of basically what Christians would understand perhaps as an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, of this kind of period where they are being, where God is showing his movement among the Christian population and among non-Christians as well in very obvious ways, right? So there's this feeling, there's this kind of onset of grace. And this is interesting in many ways because this is going to be connected to kind of Pentecostal Christianity. So if you're familiar with Pentecostal Christianity, right, it's this kind of Christianity that emphasizes the activity of the Holy Spirit, often made manifest in speaking in tongues, in supernatural phenomena such as healings and things like that. And people, there's this kind of ecstasy associated with people will often have very, trying to think of a way to express this. People will cry, will laugh, will kind of show this emotional exuberance and power that is understood in a supernatural way. There's oftentimes the confession of sin publicly and public acts of forgiveness as part of this. And this is a time period when Pentecostal Christianity is just kind of really starting to develop. And what I think is fascinating is that there are revivals like this that have Pentecostal kind of characteristics that happen in Wales and India. And what happens is you'll have it happen in one place and then people will learn about it in another place and then say, we will want that too. And they'll pray for it to happen and then it will happen, right? And so it happens in Korea. Koreans hear about this happening in Wales and India and they're like, okay, God, we want this too. And then it happens. And my point here, and we're focusing in this class on human action. My point, what I just want to show is how you have this kind of this international Protestant Christian community that's developing, right? That Korean Christians have a sense that they belong to the same group as people, Protestant Christians in Wales and Protestant Christians in India, right? So there's a sense that we're part of this international kind of community held together by God and these amazing gifts that he is giving us, this amazing outpouring of grace. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. Another thing I want to emphasize is, though, how this could challenge American Protestant Christianity. Because, of course, I was just talking, if you're familiar with Presbyterian Christianity, where I said that's going to be the dominant form in Korea, though there's also Methodism, you may say, wait a second, they're different from Pentecostals, right? And that's true. When you think of Presbyterian Christians, remember, you think of this kind of very conservative, often style of worship, very orderly, oftentimes not Pentecostal. And so I talked about how American missionaries are coming and they're kind of giving Koreans new education opportunities. Women are able to go to college in the United States thanks to Protestant missionaries and so forth. And of course, Protestant Christians are spreading their understanding of Christianity. But we have to remember, Korean Christians, the Koreans who are converting to Christianity, they get a vote too. Right? They get to say, hey, we think Christianity should work this way. Now, the Protestant missionaries from the United States, and I want to stress there's also some from Canada and New Zealand and Australia as well. Most of the examples I know are from American Protestants, and they tend to be the dominant ones. They're the ones that are in charge, right? But they have to listen to Koreans, and they can be impacted by what they see there. So one thing I think is really striking is that the Presbyterians at this time, and I don't know about Presbyterians today, so I want to be careful about what I say here, but the Presbyterians at this time, by and large, believed that the time of miracles ended with the death of the last apostle. Very different from Catholics, right? Catholics, miracles still happen today. But these Presbyterians, they thought that miracles had ended with the death of the last apostle. Right, so that miracles are not something that you see, at least not such obvious miracles. And they tended not to do things like exorcisms, right? They tended to play down the idea of the devil, like or a devil, like possessing someone. But Koreans saw things differently. Koreans said, but the Bible says that you should be healed and that healing can happen. And it doesn't say, I don't say anything here about the death of the last apostle stopping that. So we want you to pray for us to be healed, right? We'll come back especially to talk about healing later. In addition, they would say to Protestant missionaries, okay, we left the old religion and the gods are angry at us and they've possessed one of my family members. You need to come and pray for my family member to drive out the evil god that has taken them over. And American Protestant missionaries were like, this is kind of weird. We were told that this kind of thing didn't happen. But then they would go visit the person who they claimed was possessed, and they're like, this person does really seem possessed. They would pray over them, and they would get better. And so this challenged these American Protestant views. Now, I want to stress, I'm not saying this is always where this class gets a little complex, because we're talking about what people see that would be understood as supernatural phenomenon. I'm not taking a stance on that. What I do want to stress, though, is that what's happening is Koreans who convert to Christianity still have a foot in the old world. And in the old world, there are evil spirits, there's these evil gods. And when they read the New Testament, they say, well, God is supposed to protect us from that, and God also promises healing. So we need to deal with that. And American Protestant Christians who are there are saying, we were taught by our home church that these things are gone now, that these things don't happen, but we're seeing them happen. So we need to change our ideas, right? So again, and key also, I just want us to understand, as the missionaries are changing Korea is changing the missionaries. And these Korean Protestants who are converting to Christianity, they get a say too. And they help lead to this transformation. And so that's one reason why the Great Revival is going to happen in the way it does, where it's going to have this very strong ecstatic quality, lots of emotion, because that's something that goes along with Korean religion. Now, this is meant to focus on Protestant Christianity. I do need to mention just a little bit about Catholicism during this time period. It's still there. Eventually there will be more Protestants than Catholics during this time period because Catholics have been there longer. There's more. They're going to be in competition with each other. There's going to be competition between Catholics and Protestants. In part, this is exacerbated, I think, by the fact that they're from different countries. The Catholic missionaries are mostly French and German. The Protestants are mostly English-speaking, American, Australian, Canadian, and so forth. And so that's one thing that makes this a little bit different. And there's going to be conflict as they compete for power, in a sense. And you're actually going to have fighting break out at times. Not many people will get killed, but you do have cases where there is fighting basically over turf and over power. And what will happen is sometimes people will convert to Christianity, not because they believe in the doctrine, but because they know the missionaries are powerful and they want to get their help and their assistance and support. And sometimes that will lead to conflict. And I do need to mention that. I don't want us to think Catholics disappeared. I also do want to note that there is some conflict here. Now, unfortunately, what's going to happen to Korea is they're going to be annexed by Japan in the year 1910. And again, this isn't a political history, but I don't want to go too much into this. But basically, when Japan comes in and takes over Korea, it really treats Korea like a conquered country. It basically establishes in Korea a military dictatorship. So all Korean newspapers are shut down, for example. There's multiple Korean newspapers. Japanese government shuts them all down. And it will restrict freedom of assembly, freedom of speech in many ways. But there is an understanding of Japan that it can't restrict freedom of religion. Especially, it has to leave Protestant Christians alone because Japan, for example, is in an alliance with Great Britain. Great Britain has some of the missionaries, of course, are British. It wants to keep good relations with the United States during this time period. A lot of the missionaries are American. So there's going to be this struggle over Christianity in the Japanese colonial period over what it means and how it should be used. There's a suspicion among the Japanese that you can see here. This is a American missionary. Kind of looks like Uncle Sam. I don't think that's what it's supposed to be. American missionary, and he's baptizing Koreans. And this, though, says freedom. And basically, there's this Japanese fear that American missionaries are behind resistance to Japan. And you can see these are Korean guerrilla soldiers who are fighting to restore Korea's independence. But the key thing here is that there's this Japanese government who wants to control Korea, is able to exert a lot of control. One area that they have trouble controlling, though, is the Christian missionaries. And they're nervous about that because they see Christian missionaries as encouraging Korean ideas of independence, of freedom from Japan. And that's more or less true. it gets tricky. The American Protestant missionaries will tell Koreans you should accept the government, but they also they teach history in their schools where they talk about the American revolutionaries overthrowing the British government, or not overthrowing, but kicking them out and becoming an independent country. And certainly American and British and other missionaries do teach ideas that challenge this kind of restrictive government that Japan is establishing. So then you've got Korean Christians who want a lot of times the missionaries to use their power and use Christianity to oppose Japan. And then you had the Christian missionaries who were kind of ambiguous about this, that for them, they didn't come to Korea to restore Korea to independence. They came to Korea to spread Christianity, right? So there's this three-way struggle over Christianity during this time period between the Japanese government, who wants to prevent Christianity from being used as a way of encouraging freedom for Koreans, of encouraging anti-Japanese resistance, of encouraging independence. Then you've got Koreans who want to do those things that Japan doesn't want them to do. And you've got the missionaries who are often sympathetic, who would like to help Korean Christians, but who came here, again, fundamentally to spread Christianity. So it creates this very complex dynamic. And to give you an example of how it's going to kind of play out, there's this thing called the 105-man incident, in which the Japanese government said that there was this vast conspiracy of over 100 people to assassinate the Japanese official who was in charge of Korea. That was the 105-man incident. It was basically arguing that there was this huge, vast conspiracy to assassinate a high Japanese official. Of these 105 men, I think 103 were Protestant Christians. Right. I don't believe there were any Catholics, but of these 105 men, over 100 were Protestant Christians. Again, Protestant Christianity in this time period is only a couple percent. But what happens is a lot of the most educated people, a lot of the ones who are most able to challenge the government are Protestant Christians. And so the government launches these false accusations against them, arrests them, and tortures them to get them to confess to this crazy conspiracy. And it gets to the point where they're even saying, yeah, the missionaries were behind this. They bought me a gun and were going to have me shoot the high Japanese official. Now, all this was completely made up. There is no hard evidence of this. The only evidence is false confessions under torture that the people who made the confessions, as soon as they could, said, yeah, I didn't mean that. The torture was too bad, and I had to do it. And this eventually embarrassed the Japanese government because the missionaries made it known publicly. Right, the missionaries were able to communicate. What they did was they said, hey, Presbyterian Church in the United States, look at what the Japanese government is doing to the Presbyterian Church in Korea. And this was highly embarrassing for the Japanese government and led to pressure from the American government to the Japanese, say, hey, knock this stuff off. So you can see the power of the missionaries. And again, this kind of issue where the Japanese government just is like, we don't really like the missionaries. We'd like to limit their influence. We want to limit the influence of Protestant Christianity in Korea because it's dangerous, because you've got these leaders who could challenge us. And so this creates kind of a problem for Japan. It's very embarrassing. Now, I do want to point out, before we continue on with this, during this time period, I don't want us to think it was just politics. And I also want to note that you do have, as Christianity gets a greater legal space and ideas of gender are changing, you're going to have women play a larger role in the actual practice of Christianity and its spread. So, for example, Protestant Christians are going to establish this kind of institute of what we would call Bible women. And these are women missionaries who are taught to read and write. A lot of Koreans at this time don't know how to read and write. They learn to read and write, they learn to read the Bible, and they learn to spread Christianity. And they have access to women, whereas men don't. Right. And a lot of times these are middle-aged women with children. And so they're able to work among women like that. And again, this idea is you convert the mothers, they're also going to convert their children. And this gives these women a kind of agency, though, to also shape Christianity, right? Because these Bible women are going to talk to other Korean women and they're going to apply what they think is important from the Bible. We have a similar thing going on among Korean Catholic women, that now that the persecutions are over, they can actually establish convents, and they will bring nuns, especially from France, who will establish convents where Korean women can become Catholic nuns. Now, they're not going to have as much of a missionary reach as their Protestant sisters, but they will still do a lot of things for missionary work and for trying to help the poor and things like that. and they will also often work in schools teaching. But again, I want to stress, it didn't just stay within kind of the Christian church. There are women who are going to take political action. And one woman I want to mention is this woman, Yu Kwan-soon. Now, Yu Kwan-soon, I want to emphasize, she was not from Seoul. She was the capital. She was from the provinces. She was from the countryside. And she was born into a family that would become Methodist. And there was a Methodist missionary who would visit named Alice Sharp and visit their village and visit the church. And when there was no missionary around, her family, I'm talking about Yu Kwan-soon's family, was actually in charge of the church. And this missionary would visit Alice Sharp, and she noticed that Yu Kwan-soon was a pretty smart girl. And she said, you know what would help Yu Kwan-soon? I think she needs an education. I think she needs to go to a modern school. And the Protestant Christians by this time had developed a modern school for girls in Seoul. And so through Alice Sharp's intercession, through her assistance, they're going to actually be able to send her there to receive an education. And this is really a big deal, right? I want to emphasize this. This was not, even just 20 or 30 years before this was not an opportunity that was available to Korean women, that they would be able to have, especially Korean women who lived in the provinces. But through these Protestant Christian missionary networks, she's going to be able to receive an education. And what's going to happen is, where Korea is annexed in 1910, in 1914 you have the beginning of World War I. The war ends in 1918, and there's this argument made by President Woodrow Wilson, a Presbyterian from the United States, and he argues that the reason we had war was because we didn't fulfill the national aspirations of different people. And if we want to have peace, we need to fulfill their national aspirations. We need this thing called self-determination of nations, which means that if there's a nation and it wants to have an independent country, it should have an independent country. And this is music to Koreans' ears, because they see themselves, and correctly, as a country that has been wrongfully taken over, and they want to become independent. And what Woodrow Wilson, like I said, a good Presbyterian, is saying, from the United States, a powerful country, he based around Protestant civilization, he is saying we need to have self-determination nations. So we Koreans, we need to assert that we want to be an independent country, and then it is going to happen, because that's what the American president said would happen. So on March 1st, 1919, Koreans launch an independence movement. And the independence movement basically consists of Korean people saying, we're independent, and waving Korean flags and shouting Korean independence, long live Korean independence. And Yu Kwan-soon helps to organize this. Right? I think it's fascinating. She's like 18, 19 in this time, and she actually helps to organize this movement. Now, she's not in the top leadership, but she's one of many students who go to Protestant Christian schools who are going to take a part in organizing local protests. And that's what she does. Right? So you can see through this Protestant missionary network, not only does she develop religious ideas associated with Protestant Christianity, she also develops political ideas. This idea that Korea should be an independent country. And that's supported, in a sense, by the teachings of the school, indirectly, if not directly. Now, I wish I could say that this story had a nice, happy ending, but the Japanese government is going to come down hard on the protesters. Yu Kwan-soon's parents will both die. She will be arrested, thrown in prison, where she essentially dies of mistreatment. And so on one side, this shows the kind of transformation that Protestant Christianity to bring to Korea, let this young woman have opportunities she would not have had in the past. It also ends very tragically, right? And this is the problem being a colonized nation. And during the Japanese repression of this, there are direct attacks on Christians. And again, they're targeted because they are part of this kind of network. They're seen as really key to as being key to the independence movement. So let me give you an example. Koreans at this time, only about 2 to 3% of Koreans at this time claimed a religious identity. It doesn't mean they didn't have religious beliefs or religious practice. They just didn't see themselves as belonging to a religion. In the Declaration of Independence from the March 1st movement, of the 33 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 17 were Protestant Christian, 16 came from a new religion, and 2 were Buddhist monks. So think about that. And only, like I said, there's not that many Protestant Christians. They're like less than 1% of the population at this time period, but 17 are going to sign the Declaration of Independence. So when the Japanese government came down hard on this movement, it especially focused on Protestant Christianity. So, for example, especially in particular, there was a massacre where the Japanese basically made these Protestant Christians go inside a church and then burned the church down and shot anyone that came out. And what happens is, again, you have these networks. You have Protestant Christians in Korea, missionaries or Koreans, who then get information about what the Japanese are doing to Christians and send it out. And this is an image from one of like a booklet that was put out. And it says, from the Japanese domination, crucifixion in 1919. Now, I do want to point out these people aren't actually being crucified. They're being tied up to be shot, which is a bit different. They're not necessarily being killed for being Christian. But the whole point here is that if you're a Christian looking at this image, it's going to make you think about some things, right? And it definitely does not make the Japanese look good. And so what's going to happen is, again, you have this network of Christians who are able to spread information out from Korea to the rest of the world to say, look what's being done to us. And this makes Japan look really bad and leads to pressure on Japan to stop doing this kind of thing.